What's up? Welcome to the Confluence VC podcast. This podcast is meant to give you a personal glimpse into the next era of investors and operators. This week we're on Halle, Kaplan-Allen of AngelList. AngelList is the OG platform for startups, angel investors, and job seekers looking to work in tech. Halle's built a unique skill set as an operator, no-code wizard, and Twitter personality, and we wanted to have her on to pick her brain on a wide range of topics. In this talk, we discuss leveraging software and building scalable systems, why funds cannot afford to overlook internal operations, and creating a brand based on authenticity.
Yo, everybody, welcome to the Confluence VC podcast. I'm coming to you all live from Mexico, where I'm heading to New York because I just got robbed. And I'm alive and I got money to get my stuff back, so I'm happy. And I'm even more happy because we have our good friend, Halle from AngelList, who we've heard a lot of great things about. We actually been on the phone with her for an hour before this. So she's doing operations there, has a really great background in actually building companies, which not many people from our podcast have. And I guess, how about I just let her tell you all a little bit about herself. You want to hop in here and give us a quick 2-minute background?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the very kind intro. Happy to be here. My background is that I went to college in New Orleans at Tulane and fell in love with New Orleans, as one does, and didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do when I was graduating, but knew that I wanted to stay there and do something that was helping to build the community there. I had an internship in college actually working for a local incubator that introduced me to this really cool entrepreneurial ecosystem in New Orleans that I had no awareness of prior to that. And I think a lot of people don't, because obviously when you think of New Orleans, you think of very specific things, but that got me really excited about staying and doing something community adjacent. And I actually ended up, after college, going to work in the nonprofit world for a couple of years, doing a whole bunch of things across marketing, events, fundraising. And while that was definitely a fulfilling experience in a lot of ways, I ultimately realized that the pace of work in nonprofits, and this certainly isn't the case across the board, but in my experience, the pace of work just wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to be in a more kind of dynamic situation. And that's what ultimately led me to tech. Kind of like I was saying, not a big tech scene in New Orleans. I think there are maybe 2 or 3 successful tech companies out of New Orleans, but I was lucky enough to find my way to one of them, a software company in the market research space, and had a couple different roles there, working in a sales customer experience role, and basically realized while doing that the company was doing what I think a lot of tech companies do, which is they raised a bunch of money and they used it to hire a bunch of salespeople, customer-facing people, generally speaking, but weren't really thinking a whole lot about internal infrastructure and strategic operations and process. And I just started setting up a variety of like workflows and processes for myself that I think allowed me to do my job more efficiently, get more done with less time, and really enjoyed doing that to the extent that I ended up actually just going to build out a team around doing those things. So we called it a revenue operations team. It was a very small team, but most of the stuff that we were focused on was strategic process design, working very cross-functionally and bridging gaps between our various corporate teams, so like accounting, legal, product marketing, finance, and our sales organization, breaking down communication silos in a way that would allow us to grow revenue more effectively and efficiently. And I loved doing all of those things. I became very slightly technical while doing that, I like to say, in terms of getting into the no-code space and getting really excited about the stuff that I could do as a non-engineer, non-coder, and ultimately was like ready for the next challenge, as they say, partway through COVID, and got excited about the potential to work for a non-New Orleans-based company while staying in New Orleans because of this whole remote work movement, and ultimately ended up at AngelList, which was truly my first exposure to the VC world and has been a very effective crash course on venture because of like the pace at which things are happening and the volume of funds and syndicates that we manage. You really just see so much. I like to say it's like a good way to get your reps in the venture world. So I'm sure I have a lot more to learn, but I feel like I've gotten a really good crash course on the good and the bad of venture.
Agreed. I think AngelList is a phenomenal way. Like venture is a game of reps in a lot of ways. And then it's a game of just understanding who exists in what lanes. And AngelList is a perfect platform to get a bird's eye view of everything that's happening. And it's a even better way to just understand how this industry is going to change. I think that AngelList is probably one of the top 10 forces forcing people to innovate. You want to go for it.
I was just gonna say my first day at AngelList was the day that they like publicly launched rolling funds, which was wild because I was like, I don't even really know what a fund is, but people are really excited about this thing that we're announcing. So I think it should probably be paying attention to it. So that was a fun experience.
Most definitely. No, I think like that is a prime example of the way you all are innovating. Even like the way you all are deploying capital is fire. I think taking the back office of VC, making it as simple as a few phone calls and filling out a few forms and getting people to come into it, which VCs are naturally good at networking, and like owning all of that and then creating it for yourself. So that's dope. I think that's kind of a natural transition into talking a little bit more about you and VC operations. So like, I think we don't do this enough, so we'll probably spend a lot of time on this topic. How about like we open up the can of worms and give you some space to provide context and why you became attracted to this part of the venture process and how you decided to really jump into it full force and what you've been learning.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, it's a good kind of extension of what I was talking about with my experience working at the startup that I worked at previously. When I was in that role, revenue operations was like this emerging discipline that a lot of people, it was like very buzzwordy, and a lot of companies were starting to build out various strategic operations teams. It's called biz ops in a lot of contexts, or sales operations, but just this like focus on strategic operations was becoming much more of a thing very quickly. There's a lot of data to support why it was a good investment. And because of that, it felt like there was a lot of resources. Once again, like being in New Orleans outside of any significant tech hub, I wasn't really used to connecting with other people in the industry and kind of sharing tips and tricks. But this whole like revenue operations world gave me an opportunity to do that, where we were in forums and doing webinars and even going to full conferences just focused on revenue operations best practices and sharing insight and advice with people in those types of roles. And that was really exciting and honestly just super helpful in building out how our revenue operations framework looked. And so when I started working at AngelList, and actually my position is pretty similar to the revenue operations position that I was in terms of my team's responsible for designing and managing a lot of the systems and processes that allow us to support the number of funds and syndicates that we do. And so when I started the role, I sought out a similar online community around sharing those best practices from a strategic ops perspective, and pretty quickly found that there was nothing, which really surprised me for a couple reasons. One, as I'm sure we all know, VCs love to talk about themselves and what they do on the internet, whether it's through Twitter or Substacks. Yep. And like, I say this self-deprecatingly because I tweet, I have a Substack, and I'm currently talking on a podcast. So like, we all do it, but there's definitely like an element of preachiness in a lot of the way that VCs talk. Like, this is the best way to build your portfolio, or this is how you should think about thesis construction. And so I was really surprised that there was no one saying, this is the best way to think about your back office operations or your fund admin, or even just, there's so much, like any part of finance, there's so much data that exists around the venture investment process. And that can be either a huge burden or a huge competitive advantage depending on how you approach it. And I was just really surprised by that and had it in the back of my head. Didn't really know if I was like onto something or not because I was having a little bit of imposter syndrome being very new to the industry. But I actually at this time was just getting into the whole Twitter world and came across a tweet that was basically another gentleman who was expressing very similar sentiments to me, someone who had experience both on the operating side and the venture side. And the tweet was, "I'm just a boy standing in front of a venture firm trying to convince them to let me automate their processes," or something like that. But basically connected with this guy, and within, I think, like 10 days, we had put out our first Substack article or whatever you want to call it. And the idea behind what we write about is process design, automation, and no-code tools, mostly in the context of venture. There's a lot of applications for those things outside of venture as well. And so we just write about what we think is interesting. But one of the things I found in starting this is it turns out that it's not that people aren't interested in these topics, and especially in the kind of emerging fund manager and I don't know, just like a new class of people in VC that largely exists on Twitter. There's so much interest in these types of conversations. Not to say that no one except for me, I guess, gets into venture to think about operations, but I think people are like coming around to the importance of this stuff, whether or not they've actually implemented it at their own firms or not. It seems like people are very hungry for information and recommendations around how they can set up their operations and processes internally in a way that basically just gives them back more time to spend doing the things that they want to do, which is talking to founders, supporting their portfolio, fundraising, like these really like high value activities that you're not left with a lot of time to do those things if you get bogged down with all of the admin work that exists in the context of venture. And so I feel like I have this pretty unique perspective on that stuff, having come from this world of strategic operations in a startup, but also now working at AngelList, where we don't have a choice but to do things strategically and to think about operations because of the volume. And it's just a really interesting perspective, and it's been really cool to see the reception to it. And I have days where I feel not so optimistic, but I largely feel really optimistic that people in the VC world are going to start to prioritize this more and more. And right now you see it through like the rise of the chief of staff role, or even a little bit platform. Like I think a lot of people in platform positions actually fill some of these gaps. And I don't know whether that's the right approach or not, but it does show this trend of a little bit more prioritization of strategic operations.
Agreed. Yeah, I think people in venture, but I think it's like you're saying, it's the emerging managers, it's the folks who are at the best funds in the world. And believe me, there's probably only like 50 of them. And then the people who are just fully fed up with like how inefficient and stupid their existing funds are being run. Like I've seen funds that like are innovative in doing things right. And I've seen funds that like, to me, are like only a result of privilege, but not actual execution capability. And you give it like 10 years and you'll start to see these funds fizzle out pretty quickly.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's one of the things that I think sometimes I forget to emphasize is like the reason that I care about any of this. Obviously, I think it's interesting. Like I'm just a detail oriented like person, and I've seen the impact that this type of stuff can have. But more importantly than that, we all know, at least on this call, and I assume your listeners know, that venture is due for a change. Like it's an industry or a practice that is built on exclusion and things like pattern matching, which are really detrimental both from a returns perspective and just like ethically speaking. Mm-hmm. And so there something needs to give, and that's not going to be easy. And I think it's going to happen through a number of different channels. But the value that I feel like I can provide in helping the industry is making recommendations that specifically speak to these emerging managers, many of whom come from non-traditional backgrounds, whether that, means demographically minorities or just don't have the same kind of pedigree that's traditionally looked for in venture. Like, my value is talking to those people and saying, you can do more and have more of an impact in less time with less resources if you think about operations and process strategically and find ways that you can automate parts of your process. And that basically just means that these people who are already fighting such an uphill battle in the industry, like, the battle can maybe be a little less hard for them because they're not going to be as bogged down with administrative and operational work. And so that's like my one very small contribution to hopefully helping to change some of the dynamics that exist in the industry.
You have no idea how much frustration I experienced in like some of my like time in venture, just trying to get people to understand the value of leverage. It was so frustrating. And I think that the truth is very similar to like the real estate brokerage industry. It's if you're a fat cat and you don't have hunger to do that, or you're eating just fine without doing that, you'll never do it. So it actually has to be people who are in the minority groups or people who are at the like point where they're being innovated against, so they do it. Like this is a legacy industry. We're going to have the first adapter, second adapter, etc. It kind of just is what it is.
I think it's funny that some of the larger, more established firms like might not see that coming, because that's literally the model of technology. Like, it's like underdogs coming in and being scrappy and resourceful and having a chip on their shoulder and doing things in a way that totally disrupts incumbents. And that's what's going to happen in venture too. Hopefully, I think there's enough energy and kind of momentum behind a lot of this new class of emerging fund managers where, like, they do have those things in their favor, even if they have a lot of things working against them. And I was saying this too, but I don't know that in a couple years, there are going to be people lining up around the block. Like, they're not going to be Stanford Business School grads lining up around the block to take analyst positions at VC firms, because
the pay doesn't make sense.
They're going to find out that it's not that exciting, and it's not even necessarily that lucrative, and like, it's absolutely not fulfilling. I know one of the questions you had for me was going to be like, what would you say to someone who says that they want to break into venture? And like, we talked about this a little bit before. I referenced a tweet that I saw about like the break into venture industrial complex. But my like response to someone like that would be, what does that even mean? Like, breaking into venture is one thing. And also I think a lot of people say, I just really want to work with founders. Guess what? From my understanding, as an analyst at a big VC firm, you're not working with founders. And also, working with founders doesn't mean one thing. So that doesn't really mean anything. And if you really do want to work in venture, like, I would just think more about what that actually means and what you want to spend your day-to-day doing, because my guess is that you do not want to spend your day-to-day doing stuff that is in the job description of a VC analyst.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, there is some benefit to the job. I think that people should look at it as either a stepping stone to getting to their own fund, or as a great alternative to get paid to get your MBA versus get your MBA, assuming you can break in without it, or a really good way to figure out what companies to join or start. That's like to me the three lanes of value from venture. Like, there's probably like 3 to 4 more for sure. Like, it could elevate your social class. There's all these little random things, but it's not as dope as it seems.
Yeah, and I would say like, once again, just think about if for people who do say they want to break into venture, once again, think about what that means. And then if it does mean elevating your social class, like, one, more power to you, like, you do you, but then think really strategically about where you want to go work that's going to allow you to do that. And it might be Andreessen, and that's totally fine. And to be honest, if you get a role at Andreessen and that's on your resume, like you're probably set for life, at least for now. But also consider, just consider what you want to be spending your day-to-day doing. And my guess is like a lot of these really smart people who do want to break into venture can provide more value to founders by doing different types of roles. And to be more like, I don't know, tactical about, once again, speaking to people who want to pursue that path, one of the things that I think is really exciting in terms of breaking into venture is I think that, like I said, I think firms are starting to come around to the importance of strategic operations or just operations in general. And I think that there's a little bit of an inflection point between that dynamic and then the rise of and like popularity of no-code tools that has created an opportunity for people who want to work in venture and really provide value to be in roles that are whatever they're called right now, chief of staff, platform, or just, I don't know, sometimes it's just called executive assistant, which I have problems with, but whatever. But like for people who don't have the traditional finance or investment banking background, like you can provide a huge amount of value. You just spend a couple days learning like how to use these no-code tools, and you're a go-getter, you're an executor. Like you can just, I don't know, these kind of type roles, you can provide so much value internally and to the portfolio by doing those things.
On that note, in regards to Andreessen and adding value and all these things and in automating it, advancing, et cetera, one thing that we wanted to dive into is a post you put out in regards to automating the Andreessen AngelList. Can you talk?
Oh, sorry, you cut out a bit.
Oh man, I was saying one thing that we want to talk about is you quite literally put out a post that about automating the Andreessen AngelList. On topic from where we've gone to this point. You want to talk a little bit about some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. So that was like, I think it was the second post I wrote for Automatter, my Substack, and it was inspired by, so I had just done this job search that ended up with me at AngelList, but I did look at a couple more kind of traditional roles at larger VC firms. I actually have this funny memory of like when I started this job search. This shows you how little I knew about venture. I just like Googled all of the biggest venture capital firms, and I put them in a Google Doc, and then I went to each of their websites to see if they had any open jobs listed on their websites, which obviously none of them did because VC firms don't post their jobs publicly, although that's starting to change. But so I'd spent a lot of time looking at analyst and associate job descriptions, and it inspired this post where I basically just went through, obviously the title of the post is about Andreessen. That's just because it was an alliteration and it sounded good. But I went through analyst job postings for a bunch of different kind of legacy firms and basically described the way in which the role could be very easily automated. And it's a little bit satirical. Like, I don't actually believe that these large firms can completely get rid of the human touch involved in like being an analyst, but there's a lot of the process that can be done through process and tooling, especially if you apply it to the context of a smaller like micro fund, or if you're talking about like a solo GP. It's the job description is things like taking notes at meetings. That's not a thing anymore. Like, there are really good tools. Even in Zoom, you can record and transcribe your meetings, but there's some even better tools now too. And just things like document management. Like, there's a lot of both tools and just like intentional processes that firms can implement that gets rid of a lot of the work that's involved in being an analyst at one of these larger firms. And I don't think that Andreessen is ever going to get rid of their analysts and replace them with software. And actually, some of the response I got on that post was from people in analyst roles at larger firms who say, as an analyst, I use a lot of these types of systems and processes to be able to get more done. So I think that's certainly a path too. But the point, getting past the satire, the point is, when I talk about these are recommendations positioned towards emerging fund managers or people who are under-resourced and can't just throw money at hiring a bunch of analysts to do admin work in a non-strategic way. There's so much leverage that can be pulled out of automating things or even just setting up processes in an intentional way. I always say, like, process design is like the ugly step sibling of automation. Like, people love to talk about automation and it's really sexy, but there's a lot of value that you can get out of just like designing a process in a really intentional and thoughtful way.
Agreed. Are there any recs you have that maybe you can even pull from? You wrote that other piece on the emerging manager toolbox. Are there any recs you have for emerging managers?
Yeah, that I would recommend people look at that, and the emerging manager toolbox is due for an update. But I'm a really big fan of Airtable. I don't think that it's the right fit for everyone because you have to have some desire to get a little bit in the weeds and hands-on. But if you have that and you want flexibility and customization, there's nothing better than Airtable for a deal flow CRM and just managing your network more broadly. One of the things that I really like about Airtable, you have the ability to design certain views and then share them with people. So, like, for instance, if you want to create a list of whether it's like LPs or advisors in your network that are willing to provide support in different areas to your portfolio, sure, you could spend the time kind of thinking through, who should I introduce to this founder that would provide them some amount of leverage and value. Or you could just empower them by giving them a link to an Airtable that shows all of the people in your network who have opted in to be advisors and maybe what their specialties are. So maybe you have an LP who's really strong with hiring for startups. Like, you could just give that information to your entire portfolio, and they could, obviously, once again, would have to be an opt-in thing, but they could almost make the introduction themselves, or like you're acting as like a broker to these relationships in a way that's really low like input from you. Like, you're not having to put a lot of effort into each of these introductions.
That's bridge.app. If there's literally a startup that does
yes,
this, if anyone's looking for it.
There is, and I looked at Bridge a little bit, and I think it's super cool. And it's definitely a lot more. It provides a lot more complexity in like tracking those introductions, which I think is like undervalued and really interesting. I will say you can basically recreate that in Airtable, but once again, it just depends what your appetite is. So, like, I've talked or written about how much I dislike affinity, and there are a number of reasons for that, but I will completely admit, if you don't want to get into the no-code world and set up an Airtable with these customizations, don't do it, because, I don't know, it's just easy to think like Airtable's so hot, everyone's talking about Airtable as a CRM. Like, you have to understand that there's going to be some legwork in setting it up in a way that works for you. And if you don't want to do it, go use Affinity. That's totally fine. I will say it's going to cost you like 5 times more, but maybe that's like a worthwhile investment.
And have more limitations on its features.
Yeah. Once again, I'm not a fan of it, but I am not I'm not going to prescribe Airtable for everyone because it's not for everyone. One of the things I will prescribe for everyone is Visible, and no one's paying me to say this, even though I mention them in like every one of my newsletters. But for people who don't know, Visible VC is a lot of things, primarily a portfolio management tool, and it's actually like primarily built for founders to help them through the fundraising process, but they also have an investor tool, which is one of the reasons I like it so much is because it's an API first tool. So it integrates with a variety of different tools, including Airtable, which Affinity just doesn't have that same level of flexibility. but is really important, because going back to, like, I mentioned this before, I think, but like the importance of data strategy, it can become an absolute nightmare if you're working in, once again, VC, an industry where there's a huge amount of data, but you don't have systems to pass that data between tools in an effective way. It can just create a lot of like communication issues and information silos. And so I find it to be so incredibly important that tools do integrate with each other. And I'm just a really big fan of the API first movement because of that.
Yeah, I think that more and more people, like we have a full, like within the Confluence resource database, we have, of course, like standard stuff like all these templates for different analyses, contact databases, books, and all these other things. But my actual favorite one that I think is underused is the VC Tech Toolbox, or the VC Tech Stack, where there's like dozens and dozens of these tools. And I think that it's clear to me that you take out 5 years, people start to be like, here's my setup. Like YouTubers have like the, here's what's in my backpack. It's like these cameras. And I think that we'll have a day where there's a clear VC tech stack that you put as part of your like Twitter profile or bio or something like that. But
yeah, I think so too. I did make the emerging manager toolbox, and there's some like variety in it because I am careful about not being overly prescriptive. Once again, the no-code tools are the right fit and really powerful for certain people, but some people want like a pre-built out solution. And so I think it's important to, once again, going back to like how I got interested in this stuff in the first place, and sorry for the barking dogs in the background, but why I got interested in this stuff in the first place is the desire to share tips and tricks with people and not have to reinvent the wheel. So yeah, I think having more, just like continuing the conversation around, what is your tech stack and what do you really love in a more kind of like concise way than just having to, I don't know, I've spent so much time searching, like using Twitter search to try and find like where people are having these conversations. And I think if it's more centralized, that benefits everyone.
True. Speaking of Twitter, last question before, because I know we've been on for a bit. Last question before we have Clay come in and say what's up and take us out with the quick fire round is, how do you think about brand? Effectively, like different investors create different brands, and like how do you think about the drivers there and the strategies there of actually getting to having an authentic, long-lasting brand?
Yeah, so I never used Twitter before like this past summer, and I used it like as a lurker basically. And when I was starting to job search, I was looking a little bit in VC and a little bit in startups, I like read some stuff that was like, oh yeah, you should like have it. Twitter is this incredibly powerful tool to build connections and network and whatever else, and especially within VC, which is like pretty insular and relationship based. So I like started following some people on Twitter and found that it was a really good kind of educational tool, but then was like, oh, I can't, if I'm trying to use it to network, I can't just be a lurker. Like people are going to come to my page and see that I've never tweeted before and I have 47 followers and they're like not going to ever respond to me. So I started just like tweeting some stuff that honestly probably wasn't really authentic to who I am, because I had spent so much time reading the way that other people tweeted, but gradually started to network. I don't like that word. I don't think anyone does, but started to connect with people a little bit more. It was pretty gradual. And actually starting Automatter was like a really good kind of catalyst and almost like excuse to be able to reach out to people in the industry and ask them questions about the work that they did. And as I did that, and as I started writing, and especially with the piece that we talked about, automating the recent analyst, there is some snarkiness in that. And I'm a very sarcastic person. And I'm also just, I truly do not have the ability to be a people pleaser, which is why the sales path didn't work out for me. I found that people really enjoyed my snarkiness. Like that piece, I think, got us, I don't know, most of the subscribers we have on Substack, and people just seemed like really excited about it. And actually one person, I forget who, but someone gave me like the best compliment ever about my Twitter, which is that she said like a lot of women in the VC and tech world are very performative in their Twitter presence or just like online presence. And she told me that I wasn't performative, which I really appreciated. But basically, point being is I feel like pretty early into me starting to tweet, I got positive feedback for being authentic and for being my sarcastic self. And I just leaned into that because, like I said, if I had been told like, oh no, you need to polish your Twitter presence or be more like this certain way or be less controversial, like I probably just would have stopped using it. And honestly, my Twitter use has waned a little bit because I do find it a bit exhausting. But like I said, like I think a lot of people appreciate and are refreshed by me just saying what I think and being authentic. And one of the things that I wasn't good at first and have been more intentional about is my life is like 30% like work and VC and tech. Like I do other things, but I wasn't talking about that for a long time. And I think most people don't. Like most people are like, all my followers just follow me because I talk about venture and startups. So that's all I'm going to talk about. And I honestly find that to just be super exhausting. No one is that one dimensional. And if you are, I'm not interested in hearing from you. So like I said, I've started to like try and talk more about other things. It's funny, like I have some people from like my non-work life who follow me on Twitter and they're just like, I have no idea what you're ever talking about, but I think you're good at what you do. But yeah, I think it's important for people to show that they have more dimensions than just like how they think about work. And I think that can inform your work. We're all real people in the world having real conversations, and that should inform the companies that are getting funded and like what we're interested in. I think it's super important that people just show like more sides of themselves than just talking about venture and technology.
Yeah, I think we're more similar than most. I'm like I quite literally just try not to have any filters and to be exactly who I am at any point in time. And I think that's like carried me farther than anything else in this venture space, because there's a huge lack of authenticity, even though venture is the one place in finance where most people come from like different paths or gain their success from different industries and different types of innovations. And just, it's the most network driven piece possible, which is based on relationships, which is based on like real people. And Twitter, I love that you talk about the performative aspect of it. It's just, bro, if you want, go ahead, use it to make yourself look smart all the time or always look.
To my point, like I was saying, I got positive feedback for being authentic and not being performative. And so I leaned into that. But like a lot of people have gotten really positive feedback for being performative and one-dimensional. And so you can't really blame them for continuing to do those things. But I think we're seeing a shift in the industry where there's a lot more value being put on authenticity, and there's this whole like Gen Z VC movement, which like, I don't know, feels a little overhyped, but one of the things I will say about Gen Z, which I'm not one of, I'm very much a millennial, but is that they have no time for inauthentic conversation, which I really appreciate. So I think that I don't fault people who have subscribed to this more traditional way of existing on the internet, but I'm optimistic that will go away.
Agreed. Totally agreed. I think it's not that you shouldn't put out like hard content in regards to showing your intellectual capabilities, but there should always be a balance. And I think that's what most people lack.
You got 2 tweets. I was just pulling this up as we were talking that I think I retweeted. They were so funny. One, you're tweeting about fun mechanics at 6 p.m. on Friday, and I'm drunk off. There's another one just calling out. There's literally not a single VC that was popular in high school. Prove me wrong. Hey, these things are so funny. It's like
I was
so
just
different than what's
talking
like.
about that. I think that's my most liked tweet, and Okay, this shows you like one reiterating that I have spent the past 10 years living in New Orleans, spending way too much time drinking. And yes, I was popular in high school, just to be clear. But I was just talking about that tweet because I think it was my most and I got so annoyed because I had to mute my own tweet because people kept responding, like tagging their friends, being like, oh, it was like popular. And it was just like all of these people that I don't know and don't care to know. And I was like, this is so annoying. Like, why are people like being so like mansplaining in my like responses? And then I realized my tweet was literally prove me wrong, and everyone was just trying to prove me wrong. So I guess I asked for that.
I think them trying to defend themselves on Twitter is proving your point, but
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think any person who was cool would be like, she right. It's probably like maybe 12 of us.
Right, exactly.
I think to get to BC, the path, actually, it's not built for people who are popular.
No,
like traditionally. So
they have like fulfillment in other parts of their life.
totally agree.
Yo, Clay, you want to take us out?
Yeah, let's do it. Halle, I know we've been running long here. I feel there's just so much we could cover, but we'll close this out. At the end of these, we just do these quick fire questions meant to be answered in 2 sentences or less. We're literally terrible at actually getting them answered in 2 sentences or less. I think we've maybe hit that once out of like 30 episodes, but trying to put those guide rails in place. All right, first one I've got. What is a recommendation you hear regularly that you think is bad advice?
I want to say go use Twitter, which is, it's hard for me to say that because I literally went from not knowing anyone in tech or venture, at least outside of New Orleans, to like having pretty, I don't know, like fulfilling relationships through Twitter. Like I'm now doing a terrible job of answering this in 2 sentences, but I'm on a road trip across the country and I've now just started to meet some of my Twitter friends in real life, and it's so fun. But I think if you're told you have to use Twitter to get into this industry, like it's really easy to become that kind of performative person. Do it if you want, but like not everyone has to.
Yeah, we've heard that same answer from a couple other people. It comes back to your like thoughts around authenticity. If someone's telling you to do it, you're only doing it because of that. Like, it's obviously not going to be authentic. So I agree. I spend way too much time on Twitter myself. Should probably clean off it a bit.
That's the other thing. That's the other thing is like it becomes really easy to just become inundated with other people's beliefs. And like, isn't VC about being contrarian? Like, it's one of the things that I've tried to do in the past year is listen to fewer podcasts and consume less content, because I find that we live in an information overload, and if I am consuming so much content, my brain doesn't have room for my own beliefs.
Yeah, a lot of it's just an echo chamber, like trying to escape it. I'm trying to do a little bit of the same. All right, next one. In the last year, what new belief, behavior, habit has most improved your life?
Okay, I love this one because I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Boundaries around my time. One of the things that I found in my last job that ended up making me really unhappy was I thought that being the person who is always available, like AKA responding to Slack messages until 9 p.m. or later, was like my entire identity and value proposition as an employee. And that's really toxic. And honestly, it sucks because it's encouraged in tech, but you should be able to work a 9 to 5 and be a really badass, like valuable employee. And no one is going to draw those boundaries for you, and you can't expect anyone to. So you need to just not respond to the Slack message at 9 p.m. because if you do, then people will learn that you're available and continue to harass you outside of work hours. So draw your own boundaries. No one else will do it for you.
Beautiful.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think
Clay
being
is the
most
best
available. Yeah, I feel like I've gotten like harder to reach, like intentionally.
Good. I'm happy
just
for
because I don't know, I think like being the most available person is a pretty fragile value prop. Then eventually, like you start saying yes too much, it just eats away at you. Like you can't actually create or do stuff with your day, and like before you know it, you just look back, your day's done, and you're just shuffling papers rather than actually building shit. So I don't know. I've tried to be more deliberate about that. I think it's good advice. Next one. Do you want to do this one, Halle, or you want to skip over this one?
Oh, a best piece of advice. Oh no, the saying no all the time.
Yeah.
Let's skip it.
Okay. All right. Next one. Best piece of advice for junior VCs or those aspiring to break into venture. I realize it now, like we've already talked about this a little bit, but if you can
Yeah,
condense
well,
that.
I'll reiterate or sum up what I was saying before, which is think about what it actually means. If you want to work with founders, there are probably better paths to do that than taking a junior or like analyst VC role. If you want the clout and the network, more power to you, do it. And I think a good way for people who really don't have the traditional background to get in is by mastering some of these operational skills and pitching themselves to emerging managers who are probably desperately in need of your help.
Totally agree. Totally agree with all that. All right, last one from me. Who's a mentor that you'd want to give credit to?
Just gonna be really corny with this one, my mom, but the reason I say that, so my mom has actually, I think she stole it from one of her friends, but she, for my whole life, has always said, the bigger your mouth, the smaller the world. And I always thought it was so embarrassing because she's like the person who will make best friends with someone in the post office line like every single time. And it was just absolutely mortifying to me as a child. But now I've become my mother, as we all do, and am a total introvert, total homebody, but making connections between other people that I think will bring each other value is absolutely my favorite thing in the entire world, in part because it means that I don't have to spend time with them. I can just make the introduction and they are appreciative of me, and it helps our relationship without me actually having to spend time with the person. But it really, I don't know, it lights me up to introduce people who can be valuable to one another, and you're only going to make those connections if you have a big mouth and talk to the person in line at the post office.
That I'm gonna follow up after this, ask for your mom's social information and try to get her to help promote this once we push it out.
Oh my gosh, my mom has given me so many talkings to about my Twitter presence. One, because she thinks I say fuck too much, but also because I tweet about her sometimes and she hates that. So I can't wait to send her this because she is gonna love that I gave her a positive shout out.
Let's go. Love that. I feel like my parents don't know that I have any social media presence. So
that's probably better. Although she did tell my siblings that I am a Twitter influencer, which I really appreciated.
God, love that title. You should just change that in your bio.
Oh, good call. Maybe I will.
Sweet. That's all from me. This has been really refreshing. Like, we're used to having like somewhat buttoned up conversations. This is just like completely candid, just like letting it rip about like what life is actually like on the inside of VC.
I am appreciative of both of you. Thank you guys both. And seriously, let's stay in touch and let me know if you are in LA.
Huge thanks again to Halle for coming on this week, and we hope that each of you were able to pick up something valuable from this talk. If you're looking to get in touch with Halle, we've linked her social info within the description below, and you can also find her contact info within the Confluence VC directory. For next steps, if you're an investor and have not already signed up to join, we encourage you to check out our website at www.confluence.vc to submit your info to become a member. If you have any feedback for us, please feel free to reach out directly either to Tyler at gpv.com or myself at clay@bunkercapital.com. Hope to hear from you all soon.